Hello, listeners. Welcome back to the Jacob Shapiro podcast. Joining me on the podcast today is Georgi Engelbrecht. I hope I pronounced that right. He is a senior analyst for the Philippines at Crisis Group. This is one of those things where I saw him posting on X, Twitter, and I just had to have him on the podcast. The Philippines is one of those countries I focus on a lot in my own work, but which does not get a lot of play in English media, which probably most people are not thinking about. But as the title of the podcast tells you, it's really at the front lines of lots of different developments happening in a multipolar world. So I think that he'll be coming back on in the future. And I thought this was a really, really great, if you're just trying to get a macro view of where is the Philippines, what is the Philippines, why is it important, why is Jacob so obsessed about this and interested in this. This was a really great episode to start thinking more deeply about the South China Sea rather than just the, oh my God, World War III, Taiwan, blah, stuff that you get sort of in the media. So hope you enjoy the episode. You can email me at jacob@jacobshapiro.com if you have any questions, comments, concerns about anything at all. Otherwise, take care of the people that you love. Cheers and see you out there. Hungarian version? Where are we? You sound vaguely German in the way you're speaking English, but I can't place it.
Well, actually, I was born in Siberia. I grew up in the Ukraine, and I became a German naturalized citizen in the 2000s. So we moved to Germany when I was still a kid. And I come from the western border with France. So it's like 2 hours from Frankfurt. But my mother tongue was Russian.
Gotcha. You must have an interesting perspective then on what's happening between Russia and Ukraine right now.
I mean, all of my family is just devastated with what happened with the war. Goes without saying. And I think being in Europe is also very interesting. I mean, in Asia, security works in a certain way, but then when you're home, and we just had elections, our new government for the first time will try to commit to debts in order to beef up our defense. So regardless where you look at, the world is in transformation.
And no more so than in what we're going to talk about today. And maybe that's a good segue. Maybe we, instead of going at the macro, let's segue in the personal. So how did somebody who was born in Siberia and became a German citizen become somebody who lives in the Philippines now and is following the Philippines on a daily basis from an analytical view?
Well, actually, I intended to work in and on the Middle East when I was a student. So I wrote my final master's thesis on Russia's foreign policy in the Middle East. And I really thought that that would be really, my future. But then somehow the events did not plan it that way. Like an Arabic course I wanted to do got canceled. Then you had recurrent conflict. And then at some point I was just looking around, and somehow out of several options, I got a gig in Manila. And I thought, it's just so far away from Europe, I should at least give it a try. And then once I went there, I realized after some point, oh, that's really interesting. And then when I moved to Mindanao to work there, I realized, wow, that's super interesting, relevant. I learn a lot. And then, life happens. So 1 year became 3, became 5, and here I am.
It's incredible. Do you think you're going to be in the Philippines? Like, are you like building a family there? Are you putting down roots, or is it still like temporary in your mind?
Well, I would say, generally speaking, temporary. It is still, one of those countries where many foreigners, I believe, are welcome. The language certainly helps. But I think given that what's in the world today, I'm still happy doing my job now with Crisis Group there, and I have a history. But I guess, the lesson learned from the last years is we all got to be ready for anything. So kind of planning under uncertainty, as long as you have certain key issues that, that kind of guide you and your professional life too.
You couldn't have picked, in some ways, a better place if you wanted a front row seat to exactly that instability that you're talking about. I'm an American saying this, so I'll preface it with that. But I'm often struck by Europe. Even though I'm somebody who thinks Europe is waking up and is going to be sort of reinvigorated by the challenge of Russia and all the things that are happening. But you can feel in Europe that it's sort of the old world, that it's resting on its laurels, that it feels almost like going backwards in time. And even in the United States, things feel a little bit stagnant. Asia has never felt that way for me, especially Southeast Asia. It feels like everything is alive. And the Philippines itself, I mean, everybody talks about Taiwan, but in some sense, the real front line of the geopolitical drama of the South China Sea and China's place in the world and how it's going to treat the rest of the world is the Philippines. If you look at the 9 dash line, we'll put in a link to a map. It goes right up ashore to the Philippines, and the encroachments that China has made slowly over the past 20 and 30 years on land that the Philippines claims, which we can sort of get into, is also sort of a front row seat there. So for the listeners who are not spending their time thinking that much about the Philippines, because I don't think that English language media treats the Philippines in any way even close to its importance in general. What did you feel when you first got to Manila? Why, when you got there, did you realize that, oh, this actually is really interesting, that this is important? Why should my listeners care about the Philippines?
Well, let me start maybe a little bit before that. I remember in hindsight, I was reading a German novel where part of the action was actually set in the Philippines.
Hmm.
And it had some themes of, development aggression, corporatism, grassroots mobilizing, all in a very adventurous setup. But the interesting thing is, before I came to the Philippines, I knew about, of course, Ferdinand Marcos. His wife, Imelda, was very famous with her shoes, a little bit of the Cold War, and perhaps typhoons and natural disasters. Um, One of my classmates at university was from the Philippines, but you're right, even in Europe, not everybody knows a lot about this. And partially, I think this is due to ignorance, but also it's just a bit far away. So once I arrived in Manila, I of course realized it's an amalgam of cultures and traditions. It's the only, apart from East Timor, predominantly Christian country in Southeast Asia. It has a long and rich history of independence and anti-colonial resistance, especially down south with the Muslim areas. But it also has a very unique standing because of the time as a former US colony. So people speak English, but you are in Asia. Now, when you land in Manila and you see around you, you see fast food chains and you can talk to people in English. But at the same time, through the years, I realized it is still a very Asian country, but there you have a layer that it also reminds you of Latin America to an extent, which is why some Filipinos who went to Chile, Argentina, Colombia were telling me, well, actually, we felt a bit similar when we touched down there. So I think that was a very interesting melange that makes it very unique in the Southeast Asian context. And at the same time, when I had the chance to visit Indonesia and Malaysia in the neighborhood, you do realize that, because all of these interesting aspects to it, the Philippines is quite unique. It's one of the few world's archipelagic countries. It has more than 7,000 islands, so almost not as huge as Indonesia, but nonetheless, it's, quite a feat going from Manila down south if you would be interested in taking just boats or ships, not only just flying. So it was a lot of to take in, actually. And I think I learned the most initially by talking to people and reading about the history, because that's where the Philippines has so many, important developments that reflect Asian history, but also Western history, the legacy of the Cold War, as well as very niche aspects of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. And when you're thinking about, I mean, and I guess it's the Philippines-China relationship that is the thing that sort of brings people most closely to the Philippines in general. But how do you, and I want to put this in context of what you just said about Indonesia. Does the Philippines feel like a coherent nation state? Because, like you said, there's all these different islands. There's you've already referenced 2 religions. There's more than that. Lots of different languages. Like, how does a country like the Philippines, like an archipelagic country like that, congeal? Does it congeal? Does it feel like one country, or does it feel like something that is struggling to come together in some sense?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think in Indonesia at some point you had state-driven ideology having to go down to the most remote kampung or village, which was basically Pancasila, something that perhaps was artificial, but nonetheless that the government wanted to convey to Indonesians that, hey, this is basically what your country is supposed to be. I think in the Philippines, there was nothing like that directly, even though in history we had the former president and dictator Ferdinand Marcos, who had a bit of a, iron hand rule in the 70s. It never really trickled down to the effect of having a, mission to unify the whole country. Um, I think it's a point of contention, depending on who you ask, how coherent or incoherent the Philippines is. I mean, in many ways, English is understood everywhere, and so is Tagalog, Filipino, the main language. But at the same time, I think we also have regionalism, and that's not only relating to Mindanao, the majority Muslim area, but also various other, socio-cultural traditions depending on where you are in the archipelago. So some people would told me that they feel that the Philippines is clannish, quote unquote tribal, and I was surprised hearing that from some locals. But then others would say, no, we're still a very united country in many ways. It's just sometimes in our worst, moments, we go back to these primordial identities. So I think it really oscillates in a way, depending also on what we're looking at.
And this is an impossible question to answer that I'm about to ask you, but in terms of the national consciousness of the Philippines, do you do you think they have a sense of where they are in the South China Sea, that they are this sort of front line, that they're part of this US defense umbrella that extends from Japan and South Korea all the way down into the Philippines? Is there more ambivalence about that? Is it more just sort of daily life? I mean, it's very striking when you look at a map at how the Philippines is such a crucial part of the US security strategy. So are they aware? Is there a frontline mentality in that sense, or is that really just something that a Westerner is going to project onto the Philippines?
I think the security establishment, the policymakers, they're of course aware of that. And also communities which are at the front lines. So not even mentioning the Spratly Island features that the Philippines occupies, but even the most western, biggest island, Palawan, where we see, a lot of the, maritime dispute being on the ground, as well as part of Luzon. Even fishermen understand what's at stake because they interact regularly with Chinese, militia ships. They can see PLA warships sailing by. So I think that is ingrained, and I think that is also the tradition of of the Cold War to an extent, because even at that time, the Filipinos knew that they're on the side of the United States, but nonetheless, they're also an Asian country. So when the Korean War happened, when the Vietnam War happened, you have some retired military officers who were telling me about their experiences, because the alliance with the United States, is not very fresh. It's like it dates back to the Cold War. But the average person in the mountain somewhere in the Sierra Madre in northern Luzon or in Mindanao, I think perhaps, like everywhere in the world, the primary concern is, to make sure you kids can go to school, you have insurance, you can afford to get some medicine and so forth. You can basically get by, and geopolitics might be a bit remote from it. But as time passes and the closer you get to the maritime front line, then of course I think, like you said, this mentality is definitely there. Because objectively speaking, apart from the Philippines, you have Vietnam. And I think if you're Vietnamese, you also have a very particular identity as well vis-a-vis China. So I think these two countries are really in the thick of it.
Mm-hmm. You already mentioned the Spratlys, and we're going to talk about the Spratlys and Scarborough Shoal and Second Thomas Shoal, all these sorts of places that most listeners probably don't know, but are really a source of real conflict in the South China Sea on the map, and claimed by at different levels by all of these different countries: Brunei and Malaysia and Vietnam and China and the Philippines and everything else. I guess the first question I wanted to ask you on this, and maybe we just start with the Spratlys, because I was looking back at this and trying to figure out who was the first one that claimed the Spratlys, and even then there's not really a clear answer for us. You've got the Vietnamese making maps in the 1800s and the Chinese making maps in the 1800s and putting flags on it in the early 1900s. It seems to me that it was the first Marcos who claimed it for the Philippines in the 60s and 70s. Like I didn't see correct me if I'm wrong, I didn't see a Filipino claim sort of in the record before then, but they've sort of been in control of it then. And it's juxtaposing that with the fact that these are mostly, shoals and atolls, like as I've joked before, islands that probably are more at risk from rising sea levels than they are from the desires of any great powers. So talk to me a little bit about why these what seem like meaningless sort of features in the South China Sea have become so important to all of these different claimants, and why it occupies such an important space in the Filipino security establishment. Because at first glance, like it doesn't seem like that big of a deal to me in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I mean, immediately what comes to mind is the quote of former President Barack Obama, I think, who was saying that there's no need for a conflict about rocks and reefs, right? Because this is what we're talking about, rocks and reefs. And I think people who are a bit concerned with the geopolitical situation would also say, well, what's the point of everything? But I guess, the South China Sea dispute is essentially coming from different aspects of things. Like, on the one hand, we're talking about territories, no matter how small they are. I think human conflict has often originated in areas where people just fight over a little bit of land, a little bit of territory, but it can really agitate and infuse emotions that states take over. And I think it so happens that basically all these different claimants have their different history and understanding of why they would own most of these features. I think at the moment, you have that aspect, of course, but then you have the new element of China that came up with the nine dash line and essentially having a claim that is actually more vague than it appears. Like, we're still not really sure how the nine dash line is exactly defined, what it means. And when Chinese experts talk about this, you can also see there's not sometimes some coherence missing there, because are you saying that you claim the whole area? Are you saying that you claim all of the features? And that basically puts China against the other claimants, who are, I think, at the moment, all more or less happy with the features they occupy. I mean, there hasn't been any major change in occupation in the last decade or so, even before that. Um, you have also the arguments of resources that dominate this dispute. So one is, of course, fisheries. For example, given that the South China Sea is very rich ground for fish, and there have been some groundbreaking studies done by scientists that predict actually that the fish stocks will be depleted, provided states will not cooperate. Then you have the aspect of oil and gas. That is, of course, draws a lot of attention, but I think even though we have some studies, it is also true that most of these reserves are really closer to the coastlines of the respective countries. So in the case of the Philippines, a good example would be a feature known as the reed bank. So on the reed bank around that area, the Philippines thinks that there's quite some, amount of resource that it could access. But the problem is, what happened in the past is when the Philippines wanted to explore this, China sent a ship, and then things became problematic. And until now, the Philippines is not able to access that area. And that is one of the reasons why Manila is so upset with the general situation about it. This, of course, does not apply, this equation doesn't apply per se to Vietnam or Malaysia, but bottom line is all these motives intersect. And I think when you try to go down to history, we can all say that, okay, this claim makes more sense than the other one. But I think for all intents and purposes, many experts and analysts have said the best solution would be to have a status quo. Every country keeps the features that it has currently occupied. And ideally, we are not seeing any troubling incidents. I think in the past, there have been some issues between the claimants, of course, when fishermen just get into conflict or, misunderstanding. But I think at present, it's probably more China versus the rest, specifically the Philippines, and to an extent, Vietnam. So That's a very interesting, constellation, because we're talking about the territories, we're also talking about the resources, and we're talking about the maritime entitlements around these features. So all of that makes it a very complex melange of things.
Yeah, and to your point, the way that the Philippines has generally dealt with this has been aligning with the United States. There's a defense treaty between the United States and the Philippines. For most of the last 50 to 70 years, like there has been an agreement that the United States can have bases in the Philippines. We can talk about the period where maybe that went away a little bit and now it's been reinvigorated. But the real change, I think, in Filipino foreign policy was Duterte, who you already talked about. And he was much more open to engaging with China, and probably engendered some significant enemies in the different Filipino classes because of his willingness to engage with China, to say, okay, for investment, maybe I'll be willing to put some of these issues aside. So Duterte obviously has been in the news lately. Most of the listeners are probably too busy thinking about, Pete Hegseth texting Jeff Goldberg plans to bomb the Houthis. But if you weren't looking at that, you might have seen that Duterte was whisked away from Manila to face charges at the International Criminal Court, something that probably could not have happened if the current president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., hadn't sort of approved it. So before we get into the political melodrama itself, because, I mean, all politics is always local, especially in the Philippines, but talk to me a little bit about sort of the Filipino stance towards China, because Duterte, I think, really tried to change it. And it doesn't seem to me that he succeeded, that he was stymied in opening up those relations with China, and that things have reverted backwards. And that, if you're China and you're thinking about the long-term geostrategic arc of relations in the region, flipping the Philippines, or at least flipping the Philippines to neutral. They don't even have to be your ally, but if you could get the Philippines to be a little bit more neutral with the United States, that would be a big victory for you in general. So, what is the Filipino-China relationship like? Was Duterte able to make any substantive changes that will last in the future? Do you think that Marcos Jr. has ideas towards being more friendly towards China, or is the Philippines really? Should we be thinking of it more like no? It's like a Japan. It is a stalwart ally of the United States. Pete Hegseth, by the way, is going there as part of his
Yeah.
Indo-Pacific tour, I believe, coming up. So take that any direction you want.
Well, that's a really great question too. I mean, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, Chinatown that exists is in Manila. It's an area called Binondo, and until now, despite all the controversy, it's a good place to visit, and to have a historical tour of sorts, to eat some nice food, and also to learn a lot about Philippine history. I think, despite the fact that centuries ago there were examples of violence against the Chinese population in the Philippines, all in all, it was a fairly successful integration that happened between Chinese traders and Filipinos. The country itself, the Philippines, prides itself of being, very hospitable, um, soaking in a lot of cultural influences. And there are many, many people, politicians, but also normal people who are of Chinese descent. So that is, I think, a fact that is not very controversial. I think by virtue of being on one side of the Cold War because of the alliance, the Philippines was, of course, it had a very special relationship with the United States. But before it was a Cold War ally, it was also a former colony. And I think some members of the intellectual class and a part of the population also looked at this relationship critically. Given the fact that from 1898 to 1901, there was, the war against the United States before the Philippines was officially taken over into the U.S. body politic through the colonial sphere. I think some people did not forget that that thing happened in the past. And I think that's what made Duterte successful in a way. In his own twisted way, he tried to build up on this nationalist tradition of, an independent Philippines, emphasizing that they should have an independent foreign policy. And I think in general, who would not disagree with that? The only problem was that somehow Duterte was almost to an extent pathologically anti-American. It was the sum of his personal experiences. It was his ideological outlook. Essentially, he just didn't like them. And if it's not the United States, who you can, build on in the region? Of course, Japan is there as a partner. ASEAN is also technically there, but we all know that the big power here is China. And China is a reality. It's a historical reality for the Filipinos and the Philippines, and it became increasingly a geopolitical reality. And that's where he tried to pull off that détente with the Chinese. Essentially, some people would simplify it towards, we will not push our claims in the South China Sea, we will not be too assertive, and we get investments and trade from you in return. Well, the trade relationship was already great, and it's still pretty good now. But I think Duterte underestimated that China basically still took him in a way for a ride. There haven't been a lot of investments from the Chinese side to the Philippines, and the maritime disputes in the South China Sea continued. So at some point, Duterte realized, oh, it's more difficult than we assume. And just after the pandemic started, we could also see that he decided to walk back a little bit on his commitment to China and brought back the United States as a key partner. So, were people happy with that outreach? Well, if you're a bureaucrat and you're in Duterte's cabinet, you have to toe the line. I think intellectually speaking, everybody would understand that we need to have a relationship with China, whether we like it or not. But to find that right approach is not easy. Pretty much because of China is just nearby and the US is not always here. And I think the developments in the last months further highlight that fact. And then number two, essentially, we need to deal with Beijing vis-a-vis the maritime disputes at some point in time, given the asymmetry that exists between Philippines and China in the Spratlys. But how to do it is essentially the question. And I think one key lesson for the Philippines has been, despite the alliance, we cannot rely on the United States to take care of our security, because we need to provide our own security to the biggest extent possible. And that's where Marcos Jr., I think, and even Duterte to an extent, but also Duterte's predecessor, President Aquino, tried to build up the Philippine military, tried to put more emphasis towards the Navy. Duterte did some things that were constructive, but others that were not really helpful in that regard. And I think the biggest criticism that people would tell him is, you exchanged one colonial master for another, ultimately. If your criticism is the United States, then why are you now, so subservient to Beijing? Shouldn't we truly be independent? But, many realists would say, can you afford it in this particular time, in this particular region, where it looks like everybody understands that we have a power transition going on, and perhaps the Philippines would be better not to alienate Beijing. And I think now with the Trump 2.0 presidency, some Filipino thinkers are also considering that, what to do with an ally that has shown its, not always perfect reliability to other partners, and a region where China gets more and more powerful. How should we play this? This has been the dilemma for every president. Duterte was not able to fix it. Marcos Jr. struggles with it, but he still has 3 years. So I think we're just gonna see.
At least 3 years. If he's anything like his his father, we might be looking at more than 3 years. And to your point, the Philippines, the United States, at least last year, was still their top export destination, and Japan sort of in third. So when you even think about the Philippines trade relationships, it's not like an Australia or like an Indonesia that is where China is the top trade weakness in some sense. Like there's still that openness to the United States in general. That all makes sense. So you think that there has been a real shift? Well, let me say this back to you and see if you agree with this. Has there been a real shift in the last 6 to 8 weeks with the things that are happening in the White House, or is the Philippines sort of used to showmen figures in positions of power who like to say a bunch of things? It sounds to me like you're saying maybe there is some real soul searching from a defense and security establishment point of view, but I can't imagine that that's leading to any sort of reconsiderations of the relationship with the U.S. I mean, Marcos Jr. has strengthened that relationship, has tried to reverse some of the things and offered more, basing rights and things like that to the United States. So are you saying that there's been a shift there, or do you think that it's just being talked about more?
I mean, of course, the Philippines is thinking about its options. And I think even with Marcos Jr., what we have seen is, despite the fact that the relationship with the US is obviously strong and continues to be, as US diplomats would call, in hyperdrive, I think there's an awareness that perhaps we shouldn't put all eggs in one basket. And I think that coincided with the Biden approach of dealing with allies, because I think under the Biden administration, Washington wanted to see its allies also increasing cooperation with each other. So, from the Philippine perspective, it meant good relations with Tokyo, with Japan, but also Australia. And I think these two countries are really, in a way, a north-south axis that the Philippines is actively trying to engage, because it still remembers, for instance, the Scarborough standoff, where the Scarborough Shoal, a contested feature, essentially was de facto controlled by China because the US decided not to forcibly intervene. Now, we can all say that it had its merits, but I think some Filipinos were taken aback and, of course, directly or indirectly considered the United States responsible. And I think even people who are sympathetic pretty much to Americans and to the US would say, well, that has shown us that at some point we need to A, rely on ourselves, but B, have other options to be friends with. And Duterte was escalating that thinking towards one pole, Beijing. But I think, right now we can see that Manila is seeking diplomatic contact and good partnerships with everyone who is a like-minded democracy in a way. And of course, other countries. Australia and Japan are one example, but even, if you look at ships coming from European countries for port calls, for visits, they are from Germany, from Italy, from France. So that also means something, because I believe in this region, the Philippines is really trying to be the champion of the rules-based international order. It's ironic that some European countries and even some of us might be very cynical thinking about that concept, but in the Philippines, it matters so much because people believe that it's the great equalizer of international law, right? That's why Philippines went to court to pursue its case against China, and that's why until now Philippines emphasizes the law of the sea in its competition with Beijing. And that's why the Philippines, even now, with Duterte being in The Hague, also, comes back to the arguments of international law. So I think in that sense, it's a tradition that the country had also for many decades. But at the same time, we have the hard security relationship with the US. And for now, it's working well. But at the same time, we also have some other options. And I think it is a pragmatic strategy. But the question is, what comes next? What is your ultimate objective vis-a-vis the South China Sea? Do you want to protect the features that you have? Do you want to access some of the areas that you cannot for now? And in order to find out what you need to do it, these are the hard questions I think the security establishment is now grappling with. And of course, maybe looking at President Trump, there might be a feeling of uncertainty. But for now, let's not rock the boat. I mean, everything still goes according to plan. President Trump has not said anything directly about the Philippines. Like you said, Hegseth is visiting. So I think for now, we're on track. But there needs to be a plan B, clearly, because that would just be the pragmatic thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, what happens if we start using the word tariffs in the Philippines together? Because I'm sure the trade. Well, I haven't actually looked at the trade balance between the two. What is your sense of the Filipino economy? Are things going well from your sort of viewpoint, or are there struggles?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I would say, looking at from a distance, for me, it appears a bit like a paradox. I mean, we had recently, or a few months ago, this big article in The Economist that said that, the Philippines is the quiet champion. It is getting richer, the middle class is growing. It's maybe not as, huge in manufacturing like Vietnam or already as big as India, but growth has been fairly steady. But at the same time, you can contrast it with factors such as self-reported poverty. I think there was a study or a poll that said that the levels of the self-perceived, dire economic situation has been fairly high recently, especially because of inflation and other issues. And I think the other factor is the Philippines is not Manila or not Luzon. You still
Mm.
have many other provinces where we're still struggling to have a very similar growth as in the urban centers. And I think in these places, obviously, there's still some challenges that exist. In that sense, some people are a bit cynical about announcements that Philippines will develop upper middle income status soon. But then again, when I have been in other Southeast Asian countries, you also heard from local people that, well, in that province, things are not looking that great. I mean, disparity and inequality seem to be a constant pattern in many places. What makes the Philippines, I think, interesting and a bit challenging is basically the still existing level of insecurity in some pockets of the country. It has been really improving a lot in the last decade. But I think the reality is if you have uncertainty and a degree of conflict, investors might not be as fast as in other parts of the country. And that perhaps drags the Philippines a little bit down. But the population is young, educated, hungry, and I think there's a lot of potential. But what you would need is really good economic governance. I think Marcos Jr. is really building on that. He also wants investments from the United States, but how Trump will play it, given his economic nationalism, is, I think, to be seen still.
Yeah, of course, that's true for everyone. Um, you mentioned the laws of the seas and the courts, and we've alluded to Duterte. So let's get to the political melodrama of the day. Political melodrama, something the Philippines is no stranger to. I mean, multiple military coups and attempted coups in its recent history. There were rumors of coups to Duterte when he was in office. There were rumors of maybe there was going to be something in 24. You go back to the 80s and even before, like it's a rich history here. But what we do know is that Duterte was whisked away, as we said earlier, to The Hague to stand trial, apparently to the International Criminal Court. His daughter, Sarah, the vice president, who has since gone to try and, I guess, help her dad or plead his case. I'm not exactly sure what it is she thinks she's going to accomplish there with him. Um, but it does seem like there was this rivalry between, the Marcos family and the Duterte family. And at least for now, the Marcos family has the upper hand because they've basically dispatched. I mean, you can't call it a coup, but what else do you call sending your political rival away to the International Criminal Court to stand trial? So tell me what your reaction is to all of this and how this is playing inside of the Philippines.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because I was just about to depart from Manila for a short break here in Europe after the tensions reached their boiling point and former President Duterte ended up in The Hague. I mean, I was in Mindanao, in the southernmost island, observing the elections in 2022. And there, my first reaction was that we do see a historical irony when many people decide to vote for the son of the man who initiated the moral wars in Mindanao. Basically, people saying that we should distinguish the son from the father, and Marcos Jr., well, he's not that bad, and things like that. At the same time, it was pretty much in a region that was supportive of Duterte, given, Duterte's popularity from 2016 to 2022. So the two things went hand in hand. And when then Sarah Duterte became Marcos's president, I personally was not that surprised. But we all knew it's also a marriage of convenience because even though the trope often used in looking at Philippine politics is either soap or drama, melodrama, or Game of Thrones, ultimately it's also often a very Machiavellian situation. So many people had the expectation that these two families will break at some point. And through the last 2.5 years, I think we have seen a slow but steady deterioration of the relationship. And then ultimately, it led to this current, you know, very bizarre but also important constellation. I think, you know, these two families really shaped a lot of developments in modern Philippine history, and how it will truly end, I don't dare to predict. But I think you have a lot of tendencies coming together there. Looking, for example, at the reaction online and offline about uh, after Duterte's arrest, I think what is clear that you have a lot of divergent tendencies coming up, also across the population. People always cherish the underdog, which, for example, are the Dutertes now. They also don't mind here and there a capable strongman leader. Like in other parts of Southeast Asia, Singapore has been a good example decades ago with the way how discipline was perceived to be helpful in building a successful nation. In the Philippines, some of people still miss Ferdinand Marcos, who accordingly had a tight ship, and many things happened even during martial law. Never mind that some of these successes have been debunked by historians and scholars, but the idea was that you need to discipline the people. And here we have Duterte, whose nickname was Tatay Digong, like Daddy Duterte, as this pet patriarch who tried to shape the nation into a better space. In many aspects, he failed, I think, if we look at it. He benefited from the economic policies of Aquino. He also was not that successful in asserting Philippine rights in the South China Sea. But I think his biggest battle was A, the fight against drugs, and B, the fight against the oligarchs. Both of them, I think, owed their success, quote unquote, in the way how it was portrayed, based on his fans, his supporters, and also the social media machinery that was behind it. Was the Philippine drug problem that huge compared with other countries? That is perhaps subject to debate. We know that there were many drug issues around, but compared to the total population, I think it would be a bit far to say that the Philippines was a narco state or that you had cartels running the whole show. But somehow Duterte managed to build up on this legitimate grievance of many Filipinos, trying to unite the populace and feed it perception about the problems. Then when the killings started, um, people were saying, well, we are feeling safer now. And ironically, when Ferdinand Marcos Jr. became president, immediately a few months into the presidency, you already hear some complaints that crime is rising up and that he's not as strong as his father or as Duterte himself. Again, whether this is true or not, we have to look deeper into the statistics, but perception really mattered, I think. And that's what makes this whole situation right now, in a way, even very tragic, because on a human level, I think we can understand where supporters of Duterte come from. And for me, it has always been a question of democracy's challenges in the 21st century. How should we engage as a society or as part of society with people whose political beliefs are so different from ours? Should you make them pariahs? Should you vilify them, even if they themselves vilify you? Where's the bridging middle in all of this? And for now, we see increasing polarization in the Philippines, prompted by this development. But I think it's not only the Philippines that is polarized in that sense. It's just that it has a very unique manifestation of it. And, we'll probably have to see in the next days, weeks, and months how this will further continue.
Well, I think you're exactly right in that sense. So it's not just the front lines in the South China Sea, but the front lines of this confrontation within democracy. But what makes the Filipino case so interesting right now is the role of the International Criminal Court. Because to your point, you have these divisions in lots of different societies right now, from Israel to the United States to Myanmar. Like there's also the DRC. Like there's all sorts of terrible things that are happening in the world all the time. The ICC doesn't have a police force. It doesn't have an army. So Duterte would not have been delivered to the ICC unless the Marcos Jr. government wanted that to happen. And it's not so often that happens. Like you think of somebody going to the ICC like a Slobodan Milosevic, or like somebody who has lost a war or who has been kicked out and is now being brought to the court to answer for past crimes. That's not true of Duterte. His daughter, literally the vice president. They literally have an idea of maybe building a political dynasty. The ICC is also a complicated entity. I think the United States, at first it signed the Rome Statute, then it withdrew. So the United States doesn't even really recognize the jurisdiction of it, or does it? Like this is all sort of legal gray areas. And it's also strange in the West to see people who criticized Duterte for his drug crackdown, and now are sort of happy that he's been by the dark of night whisked away to some kind of extra legal process. And how did it happen? And do you support Marcos Jr. not doing that? So it's a really interesting use of an international body that honestly doesn't have that much power in the grand scheme of things. I can't imagine that's going to I can't imagine that's going to play well in Filipino society. It seems to me like Marcos Jr. took a step to get rid of a short-term problem, but all he's really done is, like you said, not just made a pariah out of his enemies, but Trump did this very well. Like he can use that. Duterte can use that, whether it's him or his daughter or his family, to say, hey, like the corrupt class came after us, the oligarchic class came after us, and unless you can deliver real economic returns, it seems like they might come back with a vengeance. I know you don't want to make any predictions there, but it just seems like a short-sighted move.
Yeah, and I think it is a question that touches upon also the contradicting tendencies and views of the Philippines as a political entity, right? I mean, like I said, the Philippines prides itself on its tradition and commitment to international law. So even if Netanyahu and Putin and all the others are not yet in The Hague, the logic would still be, we try to play by the rules here. We believe in UNCLOS, the Convention on the Law of the Sea. We use international law. So even in that case, we have to stick true to it because this is who we are. But on the other hand, you have the other element, something that, like you said, is not playing well with parts of the population. Duterte is the first Asian leader arrested. It is also that your president, the former president, is brought to a quote-unquote foreign court. The critical, leftist tradition in the Philippines would say, well, to what extent is this justified? This again smells of neocolonialism, and the US is not part of the ICC, neither is China or Russia. So what is actually happening here? And basically linking the whole procedure to the feud between Duterte and Marcos Jr. But I think given that what has happened under Duterte, and that is something that the court now has to deal with, many Filipinos would also say, especially those who suffered under the drug war, who have seen it, who have, relatives and friends who were in areas where the killings happened, for them, the Filipino spirit of being an activist and someone who wants to change society for the better, I think that should not be discounted, because the first victim groups and the first cases have already been prepared, I believe 2017, 2018. And even in other respects, there are people who say that Duterte had blood on his hands. He had blood on his hands in Mindanao when it came to the fight against militants in Marawi City. He had blood on his hands when it came to smashing the communist insurgency. And then there was the drug war. The critics would also point out that Duterte claimed that he wanted to dismantle the oligarchs, but at the same time, he put people in his cabinet or close to power who have been facing also serious allegations of corruption. And what I'm personally fascinated with, or a bit surprised, not sure what adjective to use, is that some of these scandals are not so much talked about now, because now it's all about the drug war. But there have been corruption allegations against Duterte himself and people close to him, sometimes linked to China, sometimes not. But now the battle space has shifted. It's offline and it's online, and ultimately it also touches to on fundamental questions of Philippine politics. Do we believe in something like an international law that is now being represented by a paper tiger, as some would say about the ICC? What about the dignity of trying a Filipino head of state, a former head of state in foreign country? You sometimes meet these arguments that say, Duterte is not doing well, he's sick. What if he dies not in the Philippines? It's some sort of shame for us that we allowed this to happen, specifically for Marcos Jr. But then again, it's also a very Christian nation, and many priests were actually the ones who criticized the drug war, who were saying that, we claim that we're believers, but ultimately all of this was tolerated, and you need to have accountability. And just maybe as an anecdote, let me just share one time when I took a Grab to the airport, that was many years ago. I started talking to a Filipino taxi driver who came from the southern region of Bicol in southern Luzon. He told me that he lives with his family in one room. He has 4 children, obviously a challenging life. And somehow the topic of the former president came up, and I expected him to be a supporter. But then he said, how can I support someone who has given orders like that, who glorified violence? This is not what I have been reading in the Bible. This is not what I am seeing in my church. Maybe you don't hear these voices a lot because now the social media, on both sides, voices drown everything else. But I find these stories actually very, very important and relevant. And at the same time, you also have this other guy, the shopkeeper, who said, I was always intimidated. And then when Duterte came and the criminals were gone, life really improved. It's hard to cast judgment on both of these people, right? Because it's very humane and so forth. But there's certain rules, I think, that the Philippines has to grapple with. What kind of society do we want to be? Even though it's not black and white, right? It's shades of gray at this point in time.
Yeah. We could go on all day, and we haven't even gotten a chance to go into some of the other things that I wanted to talk to you about, but I think that's actually a great anecdote to leave it on. So maybe I'll strong arm you into coming back on to talking about this in the future, because the Philippines is not going away. And I appreciate your perspective, and I'm glad we caught you in Germany. The next time we do this, we'll have to figure out the time zones. I'll have to be up at like 5 o'clock in the morning or something to get to you, but I appreciate you making the time.
Yeah, no worries. And actually, it's either your morning, my evening, or vice versa. So all good.
Okay, well, sounds good. Thanks so much, and we'll have you back on soon.
Cheers, Jacob. Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening to the Jacob Shapiro podcast. The show is produced and edited by Jacob Smulian, and it's in many ways the Jacob Show. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, or leave a review. It takes just a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us. Also share with a friend. If you're interested in learning more about hiring me to speak at your event, or if you want to learn more about the wealth management services that I offer through Bespoke or at Cognitive Investments, you can find more information at jacobshapiro.com. You can also write to me directly at jacob@jacobshapiro.com. I'm also on X for now with the handle Jacob Shap. That's Jacob, S-H-A-P, no dats, dashes, or anything else, but I'm not hard to find. See you out there.